Christmas Tapestry by Patricia Polacco. There are those who say there is no balance in the universe, that all things happen randomly, without purpose. Take, for instance, one Jonathan Jefferson Weeks. He was most upset that his family came all the way from Memphis, Tennessee, when his father accepted the position of pastor at New Baptist in Detroit. Even though their new home was on the outskirts, it was still Detroit, nothing like Tennessee. What possible good reason could there be for leaving home and coming here? Jonathan Jefferson Weeks' father's church in Memphis had been so beautiful, new, and gleaming. Everyone had loved to come to his father's services, and Jonathan loved his school. He had just made it on the soccer team, and even though he was a PK, a preacher's kid, his friends there didn't treat him any differently than anyone else. Here in Detroit, Michigan, his father's new church was practically falling down. It was rickety and old, and the parsonage was right next door. Here, everything about their life screamed PK. "Why did we come here, Daddy?" Beth asked her father at dinner one night. "The church looks awful. Nobody comes to services." "The deacon sent your father here because this little church is in such need of new life," Jonathan's mother said. "Your father made our church in Memphis into something beautiful, didn't he? You should have seen it when we arrived there." "It couldn't have been as bad as this place," Jonathan said. "Oh, but it was, Jonathan. Worse," his father smiled. Their parents took them into the living room and pulled out a photo album from one of the packing boxes. Jonathan and Beth couldn't believe their eyes. Their father was right. The Tennessee church had been worse, far worse. "How did you do it?" Jonathan asked. "Just the way I'm going to do it here, but I need both of you to help me. There's the hard work that goes into to repair and rebuild this church, but I'll also need you to be cheerful and brave. When you see what we're going to do with this church, your spirits will be lifted." Beth and Jonathan tried to smile. "I predict that, let's see, this Christmas the church will be something that we'll be very proud of," the father said. "When it is finished, people will come. You'll see." Even though Beth and Jonathan missed Memphis, they threw themselves into the tasks that were assigned to them. For the whole summer they helped clear out the trash, cut bushes, mow lawns, and plant bulbs for the next spring. They scrubbed floors, washed walls, and even helped with the painting. When school started, they were so involved with the rebuilding of the church, they didn't even miss their old friends. They were making new ones. By fall, not only was the church looking better, but Sunday services were getting more and more crowded. Jonathan's father was just what this neighborhood needed. Folks were very friendly now, and everyone was anxious to help. Even Jonathan's new classmates came to help paint. It seemed that everything that the neighbors and friends and family did was turning the church into a beautiful place. As fall stretched into winter, the church was almost finished. Jonathan's father was right. It would be perfect for Christmas. "Here, Dad," Jonathan said, as he handed up a loaded paintbrush to his father on the stepladder one December day. Reverend Weeks dabbed the last spot of paint on the sacristy wall. "There, now the artist can paint the wonderful scene we've planned," he said. "It's going to be a glorious painting of our Lord." Jonathan could hardly wait to see the painting, and it would be done in time for Christmas Eve. Jonathan walked over to the window and watched the snow steadily falling outside. "I've heard that a blizzard may be coming, Dad, and here in Michigan a blizzard can be real bad." "I've heard that too, but the parsonage is warm and cozy, and so is our new church," Reverend Weeks said as he hugged Jonathan. "It won't bother us at all, will it?" That next week brought the worst snow that had been seen in Detroit in 25 years. One morning Mr. Brown, the caretaker, knocked at the parsonage door. He looked full of dread. "Reverend Weeks, come quickly." Jonathan, Beth, and their parents rushed next door. As they entered the church, they all gasped. A dark water stain covered the sacristy wall, right where the painting of our Lord was to be. Ice built up on the edge of the roof and held back water, Mr. Brown said sadly. Standing water that ran into the building and down the sacristy wall. How can this be happening? Miss Weeks cried. The artist we commissioned to do the painting was going to start tomorrow. Isn't there anything we can do? The Reverend asked Mr. Brown. We can chip the ice to let out the standing water on the roof. He lightly pushed at the watery wall. There was a huge crack, a rush of water, and a piece of plaster fell with a thud. Dad, Jonathan cried out, now there's a big ugly hole in the wall, right where everybody will see it. I even see wooden slats. I know a plasterer, Mr. Zucker. He'll be able to help fix it for us, Mr. Brown said. Before Christmas Eve? Jonathan asked, full of hope. No, sir, Mr. Brown said. This here wall needs to dry out first. The plastering may not be until spring. I knew something would spoil our Christmas, Jonathan cried. Now, I'll call Mr. Zucker anyway. He may have a different solution, Mr. Brown added softly. Later that night, Reverend Weeks sat on the edge of Jonathan's bed. I miss home, Jonathan cried. I know you believe God always has a plan, but what plan could have brought us here? Jonathan sobbed. We worked so hard. Then God sent a blizzard. I don't understand. Well, son, although we don't always understand, the universe unfolds as it should, his father said as he rocked the boy in his arms. Tomorrow will be another day, and perhaps things won't seem so bleak when you wake up to a new morning. Then he kissed the boy good night and closed the door. The next morning Jonathan awoke to a cold snap and freezing snow. His mother asked his father and him to drive to Detroit to pick up Christmas decorations that she had ordered from the Horrocks. Jonathan didn't want to go. He felt so bad about the church wall. What good would decorations do? Then, as if the damage to the church wasn't bad enough, the battery was dead in the family car. It's all right, Jonathan. We can take the bus. Jonathan's face fell. The slow old bus all the way downtown and back. Why do we need decorations? The church is ruined. Everybody will just sit and look at the hole in the wall, Jonathan said as they boarded the bus. Downtown, Jonathan and his father slogged through freezing snow. The wind had stung their faces. After they had picked up the decorations, they stepped into an alley to get out of the bitter wind. It wasn't an alley, really, because it was lined by little old shops, antiques mostly. Jonathan and his father leaned against one of the windows and caught their breath for a moment. Jonathan turned toward the window, and that's when he saw it. There was the most beautiful-looking piece of cloth that Jonathan had ever seen. Dad, look! Jonathan pulled his father to see. Isn't it magnificent? His father said. Wait, if that cloth is big enough, couldn't we buy it and hang it over the hole in the wall? Jonathan pleaded. The colors even look like Christmas. Sorry, son, I have $15 and some change for the bus. That cloth looks like it would cost more than I can afford. He looked into the boy's eyes, so disappointed now. Well, at least we can go in and take a look. The shopkeeper spread the beautiful cloth out on the table. Look, Jonathan, hand-stitched embroidery, Reverend Weeks said as he gazed at the cloth. And the perfect size, Dad. See? Jonathan said as he touched it. Reverend Weeks looked up. How much is this? He asked timidly. I've had that old piece here for a year. For you, Pastor, I'll make a deal. How's $15 sound? That would be fine, perfectly fine, Reverend Weeks beamed as the storekeeper wrapped the beautiful tapestry in brown paper. Jonathan, you had an inspired idea, his father said to him as they made their way to the bus stop. Jonathan and his father waited and waited at the bus stop. The wind burned as it stirred up waves of crystal snow. Reverend Weeks stepped into the street and leaned out to see if the bus was coming, but there was no sign of it. Do you think the weather is so bad they've stopped the bus service? Jonathan asked his father. No, it's just late. his father reassured. Jonathan shivered with the bitter cold. It's always late, a voice came out of the white, misty snow. There on the bench was an old lady. The bus. It's always late, she said again as she motioned toward town. Reverend Weeks smiled at her. Jonathan tried to stand behind his father out of the bitter wind. In my country, winters are worse than this. Like a razor, the wind cuts. I have hot tea in my thermos and some raisin cookies, too, she said as she motioned them to sit with her. Have some with me. I would like nothing more this day than to share a little warm tea with you and your boy. Jonathan looked at his father. Please, he whispered. We're much obliged, ma'am, Reverend Weeks said as he tipped his hat. The hot tea and cookies made the wind seem to disappear. How far do you have to go today, if the bus ever gets here? Jonathan asked the lady. Well, 2 transfers before I'll be home, she answered. Ma'am, if this bus comes, the way is shorter to my house, Reverend Weeks said. I have to drop off a package at my church, but I have a car there. I would be pleased to take you home in return for your kindness. And this cold I will accept, she said with a smile. If the bus ever comes, the 3 of them laughed. The bus did come, and the 3 of them rode through the snow to Reverend Weeks' church to drop off the package. Mrs. Weeks had made more tea and special cakes. Can we put the cloth up, Dad, before we go, just to see what it'll look like? I'm in no hurry, the old woman smiled. Jonathan and his father hung the cloth right over the hole. Our Christmas tapestry, Jonathan announced. The old lady gasped. Where did you get this? She asked breathlessly. She looked pale as snow. From an antique store, just before we met you. The old lady walked up to the cloth, took up her glasses, and looked at it closely. I made this, she said in a whisper. Tears streamed down her face. In Germany, almost 60 years ago. My applique, my symbols, do you see it? Are you sure? Reverend Weeks asked. That is impossible. She lifted at the corners and sighed. Those are my initials. Reverend Weeks started to take the tapestry down. Surely then you should have this blessed cloth back. The woman thought for a moment and said, No, it belongs here. Somehow it made a journey all the way from Germany, and her voice trailed off. She took her seat again and sipped her tea. Many years ago, when I was married, this was used at my wedding, the canopy over me and my beloved. Then it was the coverlet on our marriage bed. If there had been children, there would have been wrapped in this to be named. But then the Nazis came. My people were rounded up, herded like animals. When they came, my young husband was torn from my arms. We were separated. I shall never forget his eyes, the way he looked at me. I never saw him again. She pulled up her sleeve and showed a row of faded blue numbers on the lower side of her arm. I'm speechless, Reverend Weeks said as the whole family leaned toward the lady. Would you stay for prayer services tonight? Reverend Weeks said. I'm honored that you asked, but I'm not of your faith. And no husband. I never married again, but I do have nieces and nephews here in Detroit. So the whole family drove her home. It was Christmas Eve. There was to be a pageant. But there was a knock at the door. We didn't expect you on such notice, Mr. Zucker, Reverend Weeks said as he shook the man's hand. For me, it's the Festival of Lights. I live alone. No one will miss me today, Mr. Zucker said with a warm smile. This is where the damage is. And they entered the church together. They pulled back the tapestry so the old man could see the hole in the wall. Mr. Zucker put on his glasses and said, This will be no, I lost my place. And inspected the damage very carefully. This won't be difficult at all, he said. You need to let the wall dry a bit. I'm glad to hear that. He let the tapestry cascade back in front of the hole. The old man staggered back. Where did you get this? Right here in Detroit. It couldn't possibly be, Mr. Zucker interrupted. Could be what? Jonathan asked. My bride in the old country, Mr. Zucker said. She made this, but she was taken by the Nazis. She could not have survived that place. Why, yes, she did, Mr. Zucker. She's alive. She was here just 3 days ago. We know right where she is. The Weeks family drove like the wind. and they stopped in front of apartment number 22, and the door was open. There was the old woman, puzzled.